Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Well, here in the Ozarks, it's winter time and we're starting to expect some winter storms with that. We've got one incoming next week that's going to be pretty mild. It's only maybe 3 inches of snow. And here in the Ozarks, it can be very hit and miss with that. Sometimes they're absolutely on it. Sometimes it's way off. We've had some years where we don't have snow at all and it's a very mild winter. We've had some rough winters in the past too. In fact, the past 2 winters have been exceptionally cold, and we're actually going to face some pretty extreme cold for our area here as well. Anytime you get into the negatives here in Ozarks, that's pretty darn cold, and it can be detrimental if you're not prepared. So that's what I want to talk to you guys a bit about today. Is some wintertime preparedness, mostly for storms, but also the cold. You know, to me, this is important because I can remember being a boy growing up at mom and dad's. You know, we lived out in the sticks, out in the country, and that's where we live now. I live very close to them still, at our current place. But growing up, you know, we had some ice storms to where the power was out for at least a week. So we had to live without power for a week. And my goodness, whenever you don't have electricity, you kind of have to get creative with things, both with entertainment, but then also just for your comfort and survival. So that's what I want to talk to you about today, is a few things that you can do to not only make yourself safer, but to make yourself more comfortable if you were to lose electricity in a winter storm. So let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is having some access to electricity in some shape or fashion. There's multiple ways that you can do this. A lot of folks will end up doing, if they lose electricity, they'll buy an inverter or a generator, and those are really great solutions to give you some power to your house. Now, unless you just go really, really big, you're probably not going to be able to power your whole house, and it's probably not reasonable to do that on the basis of, in an emergency, you're probably not as worried about taking a hot shower. You know, your hot water heater is going to be very, very power consuming if you're electric. You're probably not going to be baking a cake in the oven or anything like that. You probably need to scale that down to some smaller means of cooking. And you may want to consider sizing your generator. If you live out in the sticks like I do, you may want to size it to where you could run your well pump, depending on how important water is for you. So let's take a look at a few of my solutions that I have for my case. So I've got 2 solutions here. I just happened to get a really good deal on this one. It's the only reason I ended up with the Honda. I actually bought this Ryobi a few years back, and you can see it's got 4,000 starting watts and 3,400 running watts. So this will run a lot of my electricity in the house. And if you wanted to, if your breaker panel's set up in a way, you can see I've got a 30 amp plug here that I could run that back into my house in a safe fashion. And I could even power my well. I could power circuits on my house and, you know, run my fridge or a few things up to, you know, 3,400 watts. So this is a really convenient option. It's also got some plugs here that I can plug directly into. Now keep in mind, the bigger that you get with generators and the more power that you suck, the more gasoline you're going to go through. So you need to consider your gasoline storage as well, and how efficient that these generators are. This Ryobi is great, and it's a great starting point, price point. But boy, I think pretty much the gold standard are these little Hondas here. Now this isn't going to run my well pump, but you know, I've got two regular household plugs here, 15 amp, and this thing is whisper quiet. I could run this. It has a 1 gallon tank. I could run this for days on end and power a lot of stuff. You know, it's 2,200 starting watts and 1,800 consistent watts. Whisper quiet. It's not annoying. They're efficient. They just barely sip fuel. This is the gold standard. This is what you want right here. And it's not too heavy, maybe 45 pounds or so. It's a little briefcase style. And you can just pick it up, carry it wherever you want it. Obviously, you want to keep this outside, not in your house because of CO2. But this is where it's at right here. But don't shy away from these too. You know, if you're not using a generator a lot, something like this is going to work just fine for you. Some other options that have come popular as of late are even some backup generators that are solar powered. Now, I'm going to warn you, with something like that, you have to make sure that you have enough sunlight or access to a way to charge that to really make it efficient. My gasoline operated generators, I can run those for days on end. As long as I have gasoline, I have basically an unlimited fuel supply. Whereas if you go into the battery powered world, yeah, it's convenient, it's quiet, it's nice in that sense. But if you're putting out more juice than what you're taking in with solar panels, which aren't as efficient as this gasoline in a lot of senses, then then you may be absolutely dead on that thing and not able to keep up with your demand. So that's something to consider. If you're just experiencing a brief outage for a day or two and you're not going to run any heaters or anything like that, then you know, battery is probably a viable option. You can get some that are really nice that'll run your refrigerators and things like that for quite some time. Now keep in mind, I think that you need a completely different external heat source outside of a space heater. If you tack a space heater on one of those things, you're going to tax it, you're going to run it about at its max, and you are going to burn through some gasoline. If that's your only option, fine, I understand it, but there are better solutions out there. Something else to consider with these things here, you know, if you want some electrical cords that you can run into your house with multiple plugs, extension cords are a good thing. Make sure you get some that are a heavy enough gauge to actually carry the wattage and amperage that you need into your house in a safe fashion. Something else that you may want to consider too is that let's say you don't want to buy a generator or put that kind of money towards something like that. Don't forget too that in your vehicle you have access to ports in there as well. In my truck I actually have a 110 plug that I can plug a few things in. Now obviously you have to be mindful about that. We're not talking like I want to run a, you know, I'm not going to run a heat gun on that or anything, but something like this little battery bank here, I could plug my cell phone directly into my truck, or I could charge up this little battery bank, take it inside and plug in small electronics into this and charge it up. In the case of my iPhone, this is magnetic. It snaps right on the back. I could leave this in the truck to charge up, and at night, whenever I want to charge my phone, snap this on the back. In the morning, I've got a fully charged phone, and I could do that several times off my truck battery without having to worry about draining it down. So think about these battery banks too as a good option if you don't want to go the route of a generator. A generator, you're going to be able to power a lot more things than just a little tiny battery bank. I'm just talking strictly small electronics for your entertainment more than anything. So we've got our electricity needs out of the way. What else do we need? Well, we need to think about a heat source. As I was mentioning just a minute ago, you know, you can run a space heater in an emergency on one of those generators, but that's not going to be ideal because you are going to drink fuel very quickly. There are far more efficient options. Now, if that's your only access and your only option, then okay, I understand. But there are going to be much better options. That's why a lot of times you'll see houses having fireplaces in them. To me, that's the gold standard right there. If you could have a wood-burning fireplace in your house, that is ideal because wood has a lot of BTU that you can burn in it. And that's what we grew up with. We had a fireplace. And I tell you, whenever we didn't have electricity for a week, we had a fire all day long and everybody stayed comfortable. It was not a bad experience at all. Now, a fireplace can be somewhat prohibitively expensive if you don't already have a house that has one in it. That's why they command such a price in some areas. But there are alternative options. You can look at some things like a setup that I'll show you here that we have. In our case, our house, we have just a little freestanding propane heater. And this thing puts off 2,500 BTUs, and we've tested it. And I'll tell you, that thing keeps the house warm. On the lowest setting, it'll keep our living room up to 75, 76 degrees. Now, being a 2-story house, it doesn't exactly efficiently heat the second floor. But in a case like this, we need to condense ourselves down to a smaller area in our house to be as efficient as we can. It doesn't make just a ton of sense to heat the whole house in an emergency fashion. So in our case, with this freestanding fireplace, it can use either propane or you can use natural gas and hook up to it. In my case here, you can see I've got a 100-gallon tank that I hook up to this, but I've also got two either 15 or 20-gallon propane tanks. I keep one for my shop heater and then I keep one for my grill. That's kind of as an emergency reserve. I can get through at least a solid week with these propane options that I have here, and propane will store indefinitely. As you can see, I've got these neat little electric fans on here. These fans actually convert the heat from the stove to electricity, so they use no electricity. I don't have to plug these into anything. And rather than the heat rising straight up, it'll actually blow the heat out into the house. Just helps keep the house warmer and more comfortable. You know, my propane heater setup, by the time I bought the tanks and everything, I've probably got maybe $600 or so in that setup. So it's not terribly expensive. You can install it yourself, but I will warn you, if you're gonna do something like this, please make sure that you have a CO2 monitor in there. That freestanding one that you just took a look at there, it actually has an oxygen depletion sensor. So if it notices there's not enough oxygen, it'll turn itself off. And I think it'll even do that for the CO2. But you need to have a CO2 detector in your house. Carbon monoxide is deadly. It is something that you don't know what's happening, and you can just fall asleep and not wake up if you get poisoned by that. So I know those things are supposed to be safe, rated for indoors. Be a little bit paranoid about that though, and run one of those. And they make them where they operate on batteries, so even if you don't have electricity, it's not a concern at that point. Not everybody's gonna have the means to install a fireplace, or even, $600 may be quite a bit for some folks for a propane heater. So another option that would be, if you do have access to a generator, buy you one of those heated blankets. You can get those fairly cheap these days. If you turn one of those on and plug it into your generator, they don't use a whole lot of wattage, but if you stay under that, you can stay pretty warm, especially if you're layering and wearing your clothes correctly. If it gets cold enough, you can wear your coat inside. There's nothing wrong with that. You need to stay warm in some shape or fashion. Once again, being very, very mindful about your location that you're doing this indoors, and making sure that you have oxygen and a way to protect against carbon monoxide poisoning. Another handy option are actually lanterns that run either on propane, or this one here is actually a dual fuel. You can use white gas, or I can even use automotive gas. And this thing, you would be very surprised. It can actually do a very good job of heating. I would say this puts off about as much heat as a small space heater. It's not going to warm your whole house, but once again, if you can get to a small area, this is going to provide some heat for you, assuming that you have those safety measures in place that I talked about earlier, and you're keeping it away from anything, because this is pretty much an open flame, so keep that in mind. Not to mention, this gives you a good light source right here. Something else that you need to think about too is your access to food and water. It's so funny. I don't know about other parts of the world, but here in the Ozarks, it comes a joke every time that there's a winter storm. You better go to Walmart and get your milk and bread. That's what everybody always jokes about. And it's funny, you go there and you'll see the milk and bread aisle just completely wiped out. So that's something that, guys, try to prepare for in advance. If you have the means to do so, try to make sure that you do have some food supply on hand. Like I say, we need to think about things that are easily accessible and ready to eat. As I mentioned earlier, you're not going to be necessarily baking a cake or anything by turning your oven on and whatnot. So think about things in terms of maybe if you have access to a generator, you could use an air fryer. You can use those for a little while, and you can cook something pretty good in there. Maybe a crock pot. Heck, if you've got a fireplace or a propane stove like I've got there, you could even cook on that if you wanted to. Heat up a can of beans or something. So just make sure that you've got some rations for you and your family that'll be adequate to get you through there. You might want to eat your perishables in your fridge first, but you can also take a cooler and set it outside. If it's cold enough, it's going to stay frozen or cold in there. So that's another option. Make sure too, in my situation, like I said, maybe I wouldn't have access to well water. You need a way to have some sort of liquid, some water to drink. So it wouldn't hurt to have a couple of maybe 2, 3, 4 packs of bottled water, or even just getting you, they even make big kind of jerry cans that are made for water that you could put 5 gallons in. That'll get you quite a ways as far as drinking water. So that's something else to think about. I kind of hit on it earlier. Access to light, that's going to be something that's important whenever it comes nighttime. And there are a lot of good options that are very cheap these days for that. As I showed you earlier, I have that Coleman lantern. That's a really nice way to have some heat and some light, as long as you've got fuel for it. But some other good sources would be candles. Obviously, once again, we need to keep ourselves safe, keep an open flame away from anything that might be flammable. That'll provide a very minute amount of heat, but at least you've got some light source to look around. And any more LED flashlights, man, there's a plethora of them out there. You can go cheap, you can go expensive. I'm kind of a flashlight nerd. I like that stuff. But if you got access to batteries, rechargeable batteries that you could charge in your vehicle, once again, like I'm saying at night, flashlights, that's something important. At nighttime, you would be amazed, especially if you live out in the country, where maybe there's no neighbors around or anything like that. You would be amazed at how dark it can get at night with 0 lights. So have those flashlights accessible. Make sure they're charged up for nighttime. That way you can see around. Somebody needs to get up, go to the bathroom, or if you're just staying up late, something like that, want to read a book, you've got access to a light there. Something else that might be good to think about is some access to entertainment. Now, as I mentioned earlier, everybody's probably going to have access to charge their phone in some shape or fashion in their vehicle or with a generator or something like that. So you've got access to that. But something else that could be good too is an FM radio. So you could listen to the radio station, not only for music, but just to hear the news broadcast, see if there's any updates or anything going on in the world. I've really been enjoying this little radio that I've got here, this Baofeng, I forget how you say it, but it's actually got a feature where I can turn it on, if I remember how. It's actually got a feature where I can push a button on the side here. And I've got an FM radio right at my hand, so I can listen to local news, or you can even scan with these things. And it's kind of fun. I'll actually scan and listen to the local police sometimes too, so I can know what's going on the roadway or things of that nature. And there's even, you can even scan through there and there's some broadcast about the weather. So a little radio like this is super, super handy. It's got some on-deck rechargeable batteries that you can get multiples of these that you can swap in and out, charge them up. And these things are dirt cheap. I mean, this is a $20, $25 radio here. So that's something to consider. And the last thing that I'm going to caution you of is, just in the same way that we're trying to prepare to make sure we have rations and water, don't be that person with an empty tank of gas. Oh my goodness. There's so many people I know that they just run that tank so close to empty and it paranoids me. I don't know. I was just always growing up, anytime Dad had a quarter of a tank, we're going to the gas station and we're getting gas. We're making a stop. And I think that's a pretty smart move. If you know there's a winter storm coming, try to make sure that you've got your gas gauge filled all the way up for multiple reasons. If you have to go to work for some reason, what happens if you get stranded on the side of the road, you don't have any gas and you run out of gas and it's really cold outside? That could be a really bad scenario. So make sure you've got a completely full fuel tank. That way, if you have to go to work, if you lose electricity and you don't have any means at your house to stay warm, that you can get over to a neighbor, get to a hotel that has power or something to where you have the fuel, that even if you have a little mishap along that way, so even if you have a mishap along the way, you know that you've got the fuel that you could leave your vehicle running in a situation like that and keep yourself warm. That can be even kind of a last-ditch effort, if you will. If your house is cooling off and you can't stay warm in there, you could at least go out to your vehicle and you could run it. Make sure, for heaven's sakes, that it's not in the garage or something like that. It needs to be in an open area where carbon monoxide is not an issue. But you could at least turn your key on and you could get warmed up in your vehicle by running the heater in there. So I think having a full tank of gas, and then if you've got access to gas cans, the more the merrier. I've got, oh my gosh, I've probably got 5 or 6 diesel cans, and I don't know how many gas cans I've got. I've got a handful. But man, that's something handy to have. The more gas you have, the longer runtime that you're going to have for your vehicles and for your generators. So that's something to definitely consider. Guys, those are my tips for some wintertime preparedness. Like I say, not only for those instances where you may lose power due to electrical outages caused by ice storms or people running into poles, but also, whenever it gets really, really cold in our area, they talk about rolling blackouts. And, it only may be for a few hours, but those few hours could be pretty uncomfortable if your house isn't heated at all and you don't have any options there. So these are things that everybody needs to think about, whether you live in town, you live on the outskirts of town, or you live way out in the sticks. You need to have some plans on hand, and you need to work towards that to keep your family safe and your family as comfortable as possible in times like that. Guys, I know I didn't absolutely encompass everything there. I'm sure there's some other things that guys are going to think about. So I invite you in the comments, leave some of your advice or tips on ways to prepare better for winter. And also too, if you've got a good story, share those. Like I say, growing up, we had a couple of winters where we were without power for quite some time, but I can remember, and I look back on them, they're kind of fond memories. It's fun. It's fun to think about whenever you're a kid, the things you'll do to entertain yourself whenever you don't have electricity. All right, guys, until the next video, stay safe and take care.